Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to comment on the handout that I had you read this week on active reading strategies. And so the first step was previewing, right? And previewing, I think, is a step that a lot of people don't do, but I think it is very important because if you just take a minute to focus on the title, see if there are any subsection titles, just look at the intro paragraph, the conclusion paragraph, you're just going to have a sense of what's coming up in that text. You'll have some idea of where the author is headed, and you'll be able to absorb so much more, right? The other thing I want to say about previewing is that it's basically a college survival skill, and I think it's a tool that a lot of people don't use and they should use much, much more often, because we all know that you're assigned more reading than you can do in college, and there's just gonna be days when you can't do it all, right? So if you get to class and you haven't done the reading, if you can just preview the text, you're going to absorb so much more from that lecture or that discussion period. And you might actually be able to participate in the discussion a little bit if you've previewed the text and you have some sense of what it's about. Okay. And then the second step they talk about in the handout is going to read through the entire reading assignment, but it's asking you to annotate as you read and take notes as you read, right? And I don't do both personally, and I feel like a lot of my students might use one or the other. Many of my students don't want to write in their books, so they only take notes. But I think it's just really important to find a system that works for you. Some people get very, very creative with their annotations and the margins or with their notes on a reading, and just find what works for you. I also think, for me, all I really do when I'm annotating is I try and track topics. I just try and label paragraphs like, oh, here he's talking about dogs. Here he's talking about fish. Even if I don't really understand quite what their point is yet, I have basically a little outline for myself in the margins. And when I think an important point is being made, I stop and I try and write it down in my own words. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing that via notes or via annotations or both. The point is for you to stop and process what is happening in the text and put it into your own words. Because there's that old sort of truth about learning that you don't really understand something until you can explain it in your own words. And that's what annotation and note-taking is trying to move you towards as a reading strategy. And then I wanted to show you, here's some of my annotations. So I do use underlining, but I definitely try and stop and label and talk about what I'm seeing in the text. Sometimes I take more extensive, longer annotations. It just depends, okay? I also think in terms of annotation, you should think about if the teacher has given you any guidance on what you should be paying attention to. So are you reading that reading because you're going to write an essay about it? And if so, you should keep in mind the essay's topic. Have they asked you some reading questions? So you can use those questions to guide your annotations if you're just not sure what to annotate about or what to take notes on, Let's see, what else do I want to say to you guys about this? Oh, and then, the final step, of course, is review. And that's really where you're synthesizing all the information that you've found in that reading so far. And I think review is probably another step that people don't take or skip quite often, but it's very important because once you go back and review your notes, or look over your annotations, something that didn't make sense when you read it at the beginning of the essay or the book may make much more sense now that you've read the entire chapter or the entire essay. Okay, so that's where the review can really be very important. And then I finally wanted to say that so active reading strategies are often obviously much more time consuming than passive reading strategies, but you're just going to get more out of it. And it will save you time in the long run, because if you have to go back to that reading for preparation for an exam or for use in an essay, you already processed it quite a bit in your notes and in your annotations, and you're going to be in a much better position to be writing about and understanding that reading at that point. Okay, so I hope these comments are helpful. That's all I got.